Welcome to the Dingometer, where we investigate ways of creating awesome learning experiences and tackle tricky issues in learning design. In this episode, my guest is Heather Maclean, who is an Education and Recognition Advisor at Queen Mary University, London. Heather is a specialist in inclusive learning strategies and has extensive experience in working with both tutors and students to identify and remove barriers to learning. Now, inclusivity is a core topic in learning design, and during the podcast, Heather provides valuable advice to help learning designers navigate issues including language, accents, vocabulary, cultural difference, digital literacy, AI and assessment. And I think you'll find it hard to leave this episode without at least one new idea you can use to design more inclusive learning experiences. So, without further ado, let's get on with the podcast. Heather Maclean, welcome to the Dingometer podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So Heather, you are Education and Recognition Advisor at Queen Mary University, London. Just before we get into looking at inclusive strategies in learning design, can you start by just giving us an insight into what is it you do at Queen Mary? What was the name?
I teach on the postgraduate certificate in academic practice and the certificate in learning and teaching, so that they taught programs for academics at Queen Mary. And I also mentor and review applications for fellowship, for HEA fellowship.
Okay. And
run bespoke workshops and different kinds of training workshops for academic staff.
And your background is you've done a lot of work in EAP, so English for Academic Purposes, but particularly around inclusive strategies. And I know we've worked together in the past and seen you do a huge amount of work in supporting all learners, particularly international students, but all learners across the board in terms of inclusive strategies. So I'm really keen to pick your brains on common strategies that work particularly in learning design, because I know you will have seen a lot of good practice and a lot of bad practice. So perhaps if we start with the bad practice, I mean, what are some of the main barriers that you see persistently in your work in higher education and elsewhere around learning? What are some of the obvious things that happen time and time again in terms of barriers to learning?
Well, there are many. One is that if we're thinking specifically about international students, for example, or indeed students who've got a learning difference, there are language issues, right? So level of language may not be fluent if you're an international student. Entry requirements for courses, you're not required to be fluent. So there's a language question, first of all. With that, then that means things like, is the text that's being used, is the text too dense, too complex? If it's a lecture, is the lecturer speaking too fast? There'll be things like unfamiliar accent. We have so many, there are so many accents in the world. It's unreasonable to think that you would know every accent. I don't know every accent. So the accent might be strange or new. How fast or slow someone speaks. The amount of vocabulary that's used. Is it very dense? Is it very technical? Is it very academic? Is it very idiomatic? All of these things can be problematic. So another things then, other issues, apart from sort of language related, other issues can be things like digital literacy, which varies wildly from one location to another. And there may also be cultural differences, expectations, for example, of what happens if we're talking about, for example, a university course. What does academic culture look like from country to country? That can be wildly different. A good example is in China, you need 60% to pass an exam, right? So when students here get 40%, they assume failure. So it's a simple little thing like that little piece of knowledge makes a massive difference.
Thank you. And also straight away, I mean, there's like an hour of things to talk about there straight away. So you've got language fluency, complex text, accent, speed, amount of vocab, cultural differences, and digital literacy. I mean, if we just sort of dig into some of those a little bit in terms of what we can do about some of these, because we just think about this in the context of learning design. Often learning designers are one step removed from the delivery. So we have to be almost extra vigilant about how we put together resources when we're preparing slide decks or videos. because we don't often see the impact of those directly, it's easy to overlook some key inclusivity strategies. And if we start with things like too complex texts, what are some strategies that we can use if we need students to look at texts? What are some ways in which we can design activities to simplify that? Because you can't obviously simplify the text necessarily.
No, I guess the first thing is, do you have to use that particular text? Is there a clearer version available? Or it's useful to check the readability of a text. You can simply cut and paste the text and put it into a readability checker online. There's a lot of, like, this is sort of common practice in producing graded readers, for example. There's a famous one called the Fleisch-Kincaid Readability Index. Literally cut and paste, and it measures. It's just an algorithm, right? It's just looking at the text and analyzing it for complex sentences, polysyllabic words. So that's a useful thing to start with, just so you know what you're dealing with, right? How to scaffold a text. If you don't have to use it in its original format, like if you're not using scans and pages of a book, if you've got the text to work with, you can make sure that it's signposted. So you could put paragraph headings. You could put numbers on the paragraphs, for example, then connect to questions. So that it's just, if you think of it like navigating a text, you want to make it as easy to navigate as possible, so that you're just helping people know where to look, putting spaces between the paragraphs, those kinds of things. Providing, if there are like very specific pieces of vocabulary, it's worth, you could put a glossary of those. So there's things you could do, like glossary of key terms. That's one thing, things you want the students to learn. But there might be other things like a little reference or a little, that you don't want them to learn, but they need to know it. So you could put a little footnote and explain that one. So you're checking for things that are culture specific, for example, that other people wouldn't necessarily know about, like cultural references, for example.
That's amazing. I mean, straight away, that really breaks open this idea of there's a text, you've got to read the text. What can we do? I mean, there's already several really useful strategies there around making that more accessible. So that's exactly what I wanted to try and get into, is like, how do you take these things that are common problems and think about a range of practical solutions? I mean, accents, you mentioned, is another one. What can we do about accents? Because, like you say, you can't change someone's accent, but if you've got someone with a very difficult accent or just an unfamiliar accent, what can we do about that?
Well, one thing is that you need to be aware of your own. I mean, I've got an accent. You need to be aware of your accent. You do need to hear yourself and know how fast you're speaking. It's more about you can understand most people if they slow down ever so slightly and just articulate clearly and don't mumble and don't gloss over, very familiar terms. So an example for us would be going, do you know what I mean? Know what I mean? We do that all the time. And we run our words together when it's a familiar phrase. Yeah. And that just sounds like white noise if you're a language learner. So it's about slowing down slightly, but articulating clearly and putting pauses, after sentences. There's a little tiny pause. I always tell, I train teachers now, and I did in the past as well. And I always tell them to channel Barack Obama. That's who you want to emulate when you're thinking about clear speech, because very concise sentences, spaces between them. He's your role model when it comes to clarity. If you're presenting, if it's a recorded lecture or something, then a very simple thing, if you're making a recorded lecture, is check that it's got captions or subtitles, obviously, and or does it have a little button, for slowing down like YouTube does it have a little button for slowing down the speech slightly? Those things help.
That's great. And again, lots of useful things around accents there, because it's, as we know, video content's really useful, but equally it's one of those mediums that can very easily create barriers if there are no subtitles, or if the subtitles are often auto-generated and inaccurate. That can create more cognitive load than the problem it's trying to solve often. So you mentioned speed. You've touched on this already. I suppose, as you've said, one way is to get people to record themselves and see how fast they're speaking. But are there any other practical strategies for getting people to slow down in their delivery? How can we sort of slow someone down consciously in speech?
Tell someone else to slow down. Empower the audience to go, I'm sorry. Can you I didn't catch that. People should time themselves. You can do things with your slide decks, can't you? Like how many slides if you've got a 5-minute presentation, how many slides is that? How much information are you conveying? So you can time yourself with your slides in a way, can't you?
Yep.
You can say, if you're a learning designer and you're making slides for someone else, you can say, right, this should take you 10 minutes, not 5. This is for a 10-minute. You can dictate how much time in that sense. You could model what speed it should be done at. If you're doing it for someone else, you've got no control over the delivery of it. You could do that as well.
That's an interesting one, actually, isn't it? Because that is a key thing that learning designers do, building slide decks out for other people, and it's easy to just put more in. I've certainly come across this where I've had to re-engineer slide decks, and you look at that and you think, there's no timings on this. There's like 100 slides here, and actually you probably only need about 30. So using the physical slides to slow down and break up that presentation into manageable chunks is a good start.
You could put the time, you could have it on, what's it called on the slides when you have it move forward automatically?
Oh yes, like auto moving forward.
Yeah, so you could set the time on that. This is how long it takes me to deliver this.
Yeah.
You could do that, but you put a recommended time. Use the slides. If you're giving it to someone else, use the slides and give a recommended time.
Okay. And in terms of, I've got amount of vocab, but if we look at this around language as well, if we think of language and vocab, and I suppose this calls into question things like assessment briefs, instructions, the things that we know all students have to grapple with. What are some obvious pitfalls there, and what are some good strategies if you're writing an assessment brief or a rubric? What guidance would you give to people to make that as usable as possible?
Make it as clear and concise as possible is the first and obvious thing to say. If you're you're never making just one assessment brief, or you're making them across a course, across a program, across an institution, that they should be consistent. Students shouldn't have to go looking in the assessment brief to find where's the deadline. It should be, front and center. Like, what do I have to hand in? What's the deadline? What's the time? What exactly do I have to do? And it's always worth, I used to do this in my last job, it's always worth going through the assessment brief and just going, what's this language doing here? What's this paragraph for? Is this explaining something, or is this just decoration, or is this just blah, blah? So if there's text on there, what's the purpose of that text? And is it clear? We used to put, for example, on our project briefs or assignment briefs for pre-sessional English courses, we used to put like an introductory paragraph, and the purpose, and it did look like blah, but the purpose of it was to introduce some key vocabulary, which then the teacher would highlight and go, oh, look, here's 10 new words, right? That was its function. So that you do need to know what's the purpose of that text? What's it doing? Is it useful? Or is it just decorative, in which case remove it?
Sure. And I guess this is where things like you mentioned, accessibility checkers, readability checkers are quite good now at pointing out things around, not necessarily the purpose of each paragraph, but certainly around clarity of language and active versus passive tense and things like that. So are there any particular accessibility checkers you recommend, or is it just sort of the native ones in Word, PowerPoint, Google Docs? Are they pretty good, or what?
Yeah, those are fine. I don't use anything more specialist than that. It's a matter of, I suppose when you're looking through a text in terms of vocabulary, you're looking at, is it technical? Is it specialist? Is it very academic? Is it very informal? Like, does it have a lot of phrasal verbs or idiomatic language?
What's a phrasal verb?
Good question. A verb plus a preposition that has another meaning. So, for example, get on with. Okay. Meaning have a good relationship with. Put up with, meaning tolerate. Okay, these are really difficult for language learners. Those are because it's two words that you know the meaning of, and you put them together and you get a whole new meaning. So
whole new meaning, interesting, yeah.
Those are tricky.
Say all the time, yeah.
Those are tricky. And so it doesn't mean though that you have to have everything written in plain English, simple, clear, right? Because the purpose of it might be to introduce technical vocabulary. It's just, is that clear? Is the meaning clear? And if there are words that you need to introduce, then you could put a little glossary or a simple little footnote,
Yep.
or provide. Yeah, it depends what you're doing with the text, really.
Okay. No, that's really helpful. I think I'd say to glossaries, I think just questioning the purpose of each paragraph to remove unnecessary words. I mean, we do this a lot in learning design with learning outcomes. When I'm teaching people about learning outcomes, how to simplify those learning outcomes and remove unnecessary words in there to make the instructions as clear as possible. But you're right, in a brief or any piece of text, like what's the purpose of each bit? Why is that there? Does it need to be there? Because I suppose more is just more noise otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've seen assignment briefs, for example, where what the students had to do was buried in a very vague paragraph. It's like, you have to do what? I don't understand what you have to do. Are you coming to me with this? I don't understand actually what you have to do here. And those, like, where it's an instruction, that has to be really explicit.
Yeah.
I need this and this and this. Like multi-part questions are tricky, of course. Those are tricky for everybody.
This is so important because so often there's so many people in roles in not just higher education institutions, but elsewhere where you're downstream from this. Somebody's written a brief, and then you're having to almost mop up the problems created by that rather than rectifying the problem at source, I guess. So this is why it's so important to think when we're designing any aspect of learning about all of these things, the clarity, the purpose, the relevance, because otherwise we can think that we're doing a good job and actually we're creating more problems downstream for other people, not just the learners themselves, but other people who've got to support those learners, try and untangle what's being asked of them.
Yeah, mopping up. That's exactly how, when you work in EAP, that's exactly what it feels like. I mean, and some texts are, if it's a conceptual thing, I worked with fine artists, EAP for fine artists. They were dealing with some really abstract things. And the texts were then, by their nature, abstract and philosophical, and were hard for anybody to get a grip on. So I guess, and then it needs to look like you want to read it as well. If you're writing a text, is to look, so scanned in pages of a very old-fashioned book where the text is little. It's like, it's just miserable. I don't want to read that. Can it be rewritten? Is there a cleaner copy somewhere? There's those things. Does it look like I can deal with this?
Yeah, that's so important. It's just the aesthetics of it. Like, is it got a lightly colored background? So is the text well laid out? Is the font clear? Is all that just straight away create a huge barrier?
Yeah, it's the font and the density of. I mean, even the little things like that. The density of the typeface.
Yep.
The typeface with little curls on it.
Serif, the serif fonts.
Serif,
yeah. You said serif fonts.
Yeah, those colored backgrounds because texts jump, don't they? Or can anybody's eyes do that on a screen at the end of the day and the text starts blurring.
Yeah, it benefits everyone, doesn't it? This is the thing. It's just one of those strategies that just makes text easier to read for anyone. If you can, whether it's a web or a printed text, if there's a light color background, it reduces that glare from the whiteness. So, and I suppose that's the important thing. Why so much of this is so valuable, because it benefits all learners. Often you make an adjustment to your practice, but actually loads of people will benefit from that. Everyone benefits from clearer text or clearer instructions, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps everybody. If you think about what's the worst case scenario, it doesn't do me any harm to read my text with the paragraphs a bit more spaced out in a nice font. That's right. My middle-aged eyes will thank you for that.
Likewise. One of the other ones you mentioned was cultural differences. Now, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on how you design for cultural difference, but I mean, what are some of the obvious strategies, I suppose, to navigate cultural difference when you're dealing with mixed cohorts, or I mean, just generally, because every cohort is diverse, so when we're designing any learning experience, we need to anticipate diversity. So specifically around cultural differences, what are some obvious ways to ensure that we don't unconsciously other people in a learning experience?
Very good question. Know your audience, first of all. Try and find out if you're designing for somebody else. You need to know, if you can, who's there, because you'll deliver it differently and you'll use different. You need to know what they do or don't know. That's the very first thing. You don't want to be using anything that has any cultural biases. You check your texts for othering, examples of othering, as you said, is in this text is a particular nationality portrayed in a negative light. If you're using an anecdote, for example, you have to be really careful with things like anecdotes nowadays. You know, giving an example that maybe makes a particular nationality look bad.
Yep. That's
off. Like if you're starting it used to be a way to start a presentation, right? An Englishman, an Irishman, a Scotsman walk into, that, but that's in other ways, that tool that it can often have a stereotype in it.
What are some ways to do that though? Because I mean, obviously this is it's a huge question, but when you're designing learning, mm-hmm. we do a lot of work when we're training learning designers to help them think about, like you say, knowing your audience, but mm-hmm. If you're having to provide example text or references, or you're building assets, learning assets for a particular program, are there obvious ways to check anecdotes and examples, or checking for cultural bias? Are there some obvious things to look out for, or is it just a sort of a Google search? Is there a problem with this text?
I don't know if there are obvious things to look out for. These are things I kind of know instinctively because I've worked with people from all over the world. I don't know if there are particular places you check for that. I mean, you would just any time that there's something that looks specific to a country or a nationality or culture, you could do a quick Google search, do a quick check. It doesn't mean either. I got these comments sometimes from academics. It doesn't mean either that you're making 100% sanitized, very simple, dull thing, like government plain English websites or like that. It doesn't mean that everything has to look like that. They do that. You know what I'm talking about.
With a white background, though, haven't
they? It doesn't mean that you're making something that's, dull either. It's just being aware that you're not going to cause anybody any offense.
Yep.
I mean, one thing to gender is, that's a whole new one that we're all paying much more attention to nowadays, right? So that it's not offensive. Just applying those. People are quite. I find that the gender one's quite easy. People are quite aware of gender and being like not being offensive, and still maybe wildly unaware of particular nationalities or particular cultural differences. So a little bit of research goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, that's good advice. And the final one that I noted down was digital literacy. So another huge area that can create, can remove barriers, but can create just as many barriers as it removes. Obviously, the vast amount of education is delivered using digital technologies, when you're in a classroom or whether you're online. What are some obvious things that people overlook around digital literacy when they're designing learning experiences or when they're teaching? And what are some of the things that we can do about those?
Well, we had a cohort of students in where I used to work, in the place where I used to work, who really had never worked on a laptop before. They were only used with their phones. And I think that's, depending on where you come from, countries which are, new superpowers or newly developed countries have often leapfrogged over laptops. Right, so we many. I guess it's quite generational, is it? They've often sort of leapfrogged over laptops and they're more used to working on their phones. Yeah. If you're designing something I guess that's one thing, is how does it look on the screen versus how it looks on the phone? We used to notice that students didn't look down the sidebars. They didn't look at the bits that you can't see on the phone screen. They were kind of looking at their laptop through the lens of like the size of a phone. Yeah. Signposting and making obvious and putting in way more links than you would expect. So you can find it here and then here, meaning, it's a link over to the sidebar, linking things very, very often, like more than you would expect to. So you can find it here and it just takes them to further down the page, for example, or takes them over to a sidebar. Making important information clear, bolder, bigger fonts, not hiding it somewhere on the screen. Key points at the top. Scrolling was often a new concept for quite a lot of students that I met, like scrolling finding where to scroll.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was, they didn't know about that, because they try, you know how to do it with their thumb, but not on the, like, don't, again, it's about not assuming, isn't it? Cut and paste was a new thing for a lot of students that we taught that year.
Well,
To teach them how to use, that was mopping up again, teaching them how to use PowerPoint before they could do the, but they could record an assessed presentation.
Yeah. And in your work around digital literacies, to what extent have you come across problems around AI? I mean, this is obviously a very new area, but I think this is, we're very much, myself included, on the fringes of this, and started to look at the implications for education. But I'd just be interested, sort of following on from what you're saying about digital literacy there. This is, I suppose, a more open question around what are your views on how AI may start to improve digital accessibility, or perhaps actually create new barriers? I mean, are you starting to encounter this in your work already?
There's a bit of both, isn't there? So assessments at university, assessments will have to change, because if the AI can write the assessment, then that's, what, then we're all redundant. There's no need for any of us. So, but it can be used in some, there are things that you can use it for, which are quite powerful, I think. So it's all about, assessments now will have to involve, we'll have to put a lot of emphasis on the student's voice, right? The academic voice, the student's opinion or reflection. One lovely idea that I heard in a webinar recently was, so if I ask AI a question, if I ask ChatGPT a question to write me something, and you ask it and someone else asks it, we'll have 3 different versions. We won't get identical text. And then a nice task, for example, is put those 3 together and synthesize it into a summary. That's a really nice task. And then give your opinion. So, go away and use the AI. That'll be, it'll help. It's writing for you. That's the thing. That's the scary thing. So what are you assessing? What do you, but if you employ it and own it.
Because if it does feel like, particularly when you're dealing with students who are non-native speakers, there's always this increased barrier, and you've got to write in English or whatever the language that they happen to be learning in, which may not be their own. So on the one hand, you could say this is wonderful, because they can now write, but they're not writing. It's the AI is writing it. So, like you say, it does seem that the question is, well, what are we assessing, and how are we assessing learning if learning isn't being evidenced through writing? And I suppose highlighting things like different modes of assessment, so providing ways to assess a task. What are some good examples of good practice you've seen around this in terms of providing choice around assessment? Where does this work well?
I've seen some great examples. So of course you can deliver like a presentation. You can deliver a presentation with references just the same as you can write an essay, right? And for some, that sounds like, yay, that's the solution, but many international students are terrified of speaking in public, so that's not necessarily the solution for them. But it works as a nice alternative, right? It's a good, one of the best ones I saw, this was really good, was like mixed, multi-part assessments, was really good, was for a marketing module. And the students had to produce a marketing analysis and a marketing plan for a brand of the lecturer's choice. And they had to present their slides, their research, their evidence. The second thing was they had to produce their research notes. So where did you get this information from? And the third thing, this was beautiful, they had to watch 2 other students' presentations. They had to look through 2 other students' presentations and, give them some constructive critical feedback. And then each student had to take that feedback from their 2 peers and write it up as a reflective summary.
Nice.
I was like, so nice. Peer review, peer feedback, incorporated, but, so clever.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the learning design that's happening within that, there's an initial piece of research, which, yes, you could absolutely use an AI tool for to get some basic information together. It might even be able to do a little bit of analysis and put together a generic marketing plan. But as soon as you start to say, well, what have you learned from this? Then that's much harder to auto-generate. If you then have to give feedback, that's a hard thing to do. And then what did you learn from this whole experience? Suddenly you're really very quickly going from just producing some text to like a multi-part assessment of what they've actually learned from that process. So yeah, I think you're right. I think because this is what I find interesting. I think there's a lot of hand wringing going on at the moment around, well, everything's got to change, and And it does feel like, particularly given yours and my background in sort of a lot of creative arts teaching, particularly, there's a lot of practical strategies there around how you evidence learning in different ways that aren't that are actually really powerful. That we can now start to think about. Well, actually, that's a really good way to evidence learning. Creating your own videos, sort of doing video essays, like you said, to show how you're synthesizing information that you found with your own work. So it does feel like that perhaps some of this hand wringing is going to do away with some of the kind of it's another essay. I'm not saying essays are bad, but do we always need to assess learning and writing? Actually, there are plenty of other ways that we can assess learning.
Absolutely. And we used to teach a lot of Chinese students, right? And the pattern generally was that Chinese students come and do their degree in the UK and then go home to China. Fine. To go back and get a job. Absolutely fine. Why on earth are we asking them to write a long essay in English, in academic English? What's the point of that? I mean, we're just torturing them in that way, right? So what are the alternatives? Making a video, making a presentation that you narrate. I mean, those are not terrifying things, and then you say, okay, well, it's yours because here's your research notes, here's your reflections. You just add some tasks so it belongs to that student. Yeah. I think the academic essay by itself I would say it's on its last legs in many ways. The other thing we used to do on our pre-sessional courses was we used to get the students to do like a viva, like you do for your PhD, because just doing a presentation online, I can read my subtitles, I can read a script. How do I assess that? How do I assess that as speaking? So we used to do an interview with the students to kind of tie together this presentation, which could be read from or memorized, and the research essay, which they submitted on Turnitin and could be written by ChatGPT or could be bought or could be, Google translated or whatever. And so the little interview kind of tied it all together.
Amazing. I mean, already I've been taking notes, and there's just a ton of useful strategies there. So just wanted to say a huge thank you to you, Heather. That's been a very quick but deep dive into your experience around this. But just as you've clearly shown, there's a whole bunch of ways there that we can adapt, make some quite straightforward adjustments to teaching and learning design that will A, benefit everybody, and B, mitigate some of these challenges that are being brought about by things like AI and ChatGPT. So, what does the future hold for you, Heather? What's your? I know you're presenting at conferences soon. So, where are you taking your expertise next? What are you interested in?
I'm presenting at Barleap in April, at Advanced HE. At Advanced HE in July, and then before that in Aberdeen, at the Higher Education Conference on Teaching and Learning in Aberdeen, and I'm hoping I must get a PhD proposal submitted by the end of this calendar year. I'm on a mission.
That's the next 10 years taken care of.
It'll be an inclusive pedagogy, but I need obviously something a bit more specific than that. But my overarching theme will be inclusive pedagogy.
Fantastic. I think that'll be a very valuable piece of work and a very valuable read to pull, as an opportunity to pull together all your extensive expertise in this area. So, Heather, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
A ton of useful stuff in there, and really, really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us on the podcast.
Thank you, Tony. Lovely to be here. Glad I could help.